The future is here. It's just not evenly distributed. If you live in San Francisco or LA or Austin, then robo-taxis are just a part of your life. There's several US cities all in the Sun Belt where you can hire a robo-taxi today if you like. If you live in China, parts of China, it's also a reality. Overwhelmingly, the chief benefit is the safety that we would get as a result of automated driving at scale. Waymo published a study. They found that 56.7 million driverless Waymo miles compared to humans, there was an 85% drop in serious injury road incidents, 92% drop in pedestrian incidents. That's compared to human driving baseline. So if you extrapolate that globally, you're talking tens of thousands of humans' lives saved every year.
I'm very excited to be here today with Andrew Miller. Andrew, I'm going to let you introduce yourself in a second. But I wanted to say just that today's episode is a bit of a special. It's like a themed episode, more so than we usually do, because we're going to focus on autonomous vehicles in this episode, because you just wrote a book about self-driving cars and called The End of Driving. And yeah, I think that I did want to preface this episode a little bit with a personal experience that I had going into a Waymo in San Francisco. I think if you've ever been to San Francisco, you've seen that there are actually self-driving cars there now, and you can take them kind of like you can take an Uber. And when I went into my first Waymo a few years ago, it was a really just profound and cool experience. And surprisingly, I think the most type of experience that I've had where I felt like, oh, the future is here. And also, I think it was really interesting just the experience of feeling like, oh, this makes sense. Like, why are we all driving around in cars and stuck in traffic when there's already technically a much better solution? And so today we're gonna actually talk about this and check in on what is the current state of autonomous vehicles. Are we about to get them anytime soon? And what are the biggest thresholds? Is technologically we actually they exist? But there's obviously a lot of other things that it takes to sort of integrate into our society. But Andrew, why don't you just start with introducing yourself a little bit and telling us about this book that you wrote?
Thank you, Beatrice. It's a pleasure to be here with you. Thank you for the invitation. So yes, my name is Andrew Miller, and I am a writer and thinker about innovative mobility, which I cut my teeth on working for Alphabet for the subsidiary Sidewalk Labs, the smart city company, the late lamented smart city company that was going to build a city of the future in Toronto. And I was the mobility lead in Toronto, thinking about conventional transport, which you would want in a city, whether that's transit or bikes and so forth, but also thinking about driverless vehicles and what implications they would have for what a city should look like. And so I got very interested into the topic. I've been writing about it and thinking about it for ever since the pandemic. And some of that writing is in my weekly newsletter. I do a Substack, Changing Lanes, but some of it is in a book that I've been co-writing that is coming out in August of 2025 called The End of Driving. And the thesis of the book, which we'll get into it, I'm sure today, but the thesis of the book is driving automation could create several different kinds of future. The one we get is the one that we act to get. But right now, if we do nothing, the default path is to a bad outcome where this technology makes life worse, which we don't want. We should act to make it better. And the book explains how that might work in practice.
Yeah, it's really exciting. You do a backcasting from these scenarios, and it's something that we've done with the accessible program quite a bit with world building. So it's really nice to actually see that very much in action. I think to start with, it would be just great if you could give us this snapshot or where we are with this today. I mentioned Waymo in San Francisco, but are we already seeing any other real world deployments of driverless cars? One thing I'm curious is because it seems like it would make a huge difference if we get trucks also being able to deliver goods and that are driverless. So where are we today with driverless vehicles?
To quote William Gibson, the future is here. It's just not evenly distributed. If you live in San Francisco or LA or Austin, then robo-taxis are just a part of your life. You've just taken a ride in one in San Francisco. I've done the same. There's several US cities all in the Sun Belt where you can hire a robo-taxi today if you like. If you live in China, it's parts of China, it's also a reality. And Beijing, Shanghai, there's a gigantic robotaxi deployment there that we don't talk so much about in North America, but is quite real. And the middle of the Sun Belt in Texas, there are lots of automated trucking, as you described. There's a whole AV triangle described there between Houston and Dallas that is poised for, they're going to have what they call 24/7 lanes later this year, they hope. A 24/7 lane would be one where it's not a pilot. You can ride driverless trucks in that lane anytime without any sort of permission or restriction. But if you don't live in the US Sun Belt or China, then you've probably never seen self-driving. So, and you don't have access to it. So it's a question of how fast right now there's 5,000 robotaxis worldwide, how fast it'll take to scale that up to the developed world.
That's really interesting. And I had no idea that it was already happening in China, for example, and the trucks in Texas, it's on track, but unevenly distributed, like you say. I mean, so based on this, do you think, are there any, like, maybe you don't want to guess about timelines, but do you have any take on like what the sort of realistic timelines for more like widespread adoption of this would be? And also then how would it be different from, we're already seeing it in part of the US, but maybe all across US and also like Europe or like Asia, Africa?
Well, if I was going to be glib, I would say 2035 and lean back. But no, I don't want to be glib because it's a question that my co-authors and I, when we were writing The End of Driving, we wrestled with. And we decided to make it very clear we weren't going to give a date. We weren't going to give a year. And the reason for that is because there's a hidden premise baked into the question. When is it going to be available everywhere? Well, that implies that the adoption of this technology is inevitable. And it's not. It certainly is not. It'll get here faster or slower or not at all, depending on what choices your country, your state, or your city chooses to make. So if we want it, we have to create the conditions necessary for it to exist. If we want it in a particular form, like trucking or robotaxis, what have you, we have to set up the conditions that'll allow that to happen. And we can see there are some moves towards fresh regulatory frameworks. The United States just in April released a new regulatory regime for automated vehicles nationwide. The EU did something similar back in earlier this year. Canada is not doing anything at the national level, although the province of Ontario, where I live, is doing some pilots. So it all depends on what policy choices we make. That'll tell you how fast it comes, or if at all. I
That's
suppose
a
I could say more about that. Like the reason, the first most basic policy question is, are such vehicles permitted on the roads? I use the Canadian example. In Ontario, you can, although you have to apply for a permit and there's various conditions you have to meet. In the province of British Columbia, it is utterly forbidden. You may not have a driverless vehicle on the roads anywhere in the province. There's no exceptions. There's no path forward. It is flatly forbidden, flatly prohibited. That's and then of course in San Francisco, it's robotaxi services. You can make money doing it. It's a revenue thing, provided you've got the right permits. And in Texas, the trucks, when they get the 24/7, as long as you can prove safety, you'll be able to use those lanes. So it really, every jurisdiction is making different choices. The choices they make dictate the results they get.
That's a very good point on the we're creating the future. So what I think maybe it could also be worth taking a step back, because you and I are, it seems like, kind of on board that this is an exciting and desirable thing. But it would be interesting to like dive into it a bit more in terms of what is the actual upside of this. Like, do you have like a summary of what you think are the main benefits that we could actually gain from having autonomous vehicles. And also, I'd be really curious to hear if, because I have heard rumors of like there's data of like when you've looked at what it would look like having, you know, driverless cars in traffic versus humans in traffic, and just like, for example, the reduction of deaths and traffic accidents, basically. That would be also really interesting to hear if you have any data on that.
Well, Beatrice, you've put your finger on it right there, that principally, overwhelmingly, the chief benefit is the safety that we would get as a result of automated driving at scale. So just earlier this summer in May, Waymo published a study. That was Waymo, but it was peer reviewed. So there's reason to believe it's reliable. They found that 56.7 million driverless Waymo miles compared to humans, there was an 85% drop in serious injury road incidents, 92% drop in pedestrian incidents. That's compared to human driving baseline. So if you extrapolate that globally, you're talking tens of thousands of humans' lives saved every year. And as far as I'm concerned, that's enough of a benefit right there. Just the amount of human devastation and harm that would be saved if we took our hands off the wheel and let the computers drive for us. But there's many other things that you can say. They're more speculative. Trucking, there has been and will continue to be a shortage of truck drivers. That's pretty much everywhere. Canada, the United States, Australia, Western Europe, any industrial world, developed world jurisdiction you're here to look at, there aren't enough truckers. And so if we could create self-driving trucks, if we could automate that sector, how much more robust would our goods movement sector be? How much cheaper would it be to do deliveries if we could automate the bottleneck, the sector? And there's others that are more speculative. If we replaced most private cars in cities and everyone just took robo-taxis, there would be efficiency gains. And then downstream of that, there's all sorts of things that we could get. We could design cities around ride hail rather than around the private car. That would have lots of benefits too. Those are certainly valuable, but they're more speculative. There's no question that safety is the undeniable benefit that we would gain.
And maybe on the contrary, I think it would also be interesting to consider like if there are any downsides. I think, for example, for a lot of people, maybe what comes to mind is like job loss. So like maybe many people are providing for themselves, driving taxi or truck driving or stuff like that. So what do you think are like the best arguments against driverless vehicles?
There are good arguments against, it's true. I think the job loss one, we can deal with that one quickly because I don't think it's the strongest. Yeah, there be no doubt that some jobs will be lost. Long haul trucking, like I said, there's a shortage of truckers there. But the more that this technology scales up, the less demand there'll be for humans to do that. As robo-taxis scale up, there'll be less demand for ride-hail drivers. Now, but of course, jobs will also be created by this technology. If we get really turbocharged long-haul trucking with automated driving, short-haul trucking in the near to medium term is going to be something that's much harder to automate. Easy to automate a truck rolling down a highway, much harder to have it rolling through an urban core to a mobility hub within the city. So there'll be more work for short-haul truckers near depots and within cities. As we get rid of ride-hail drivers, there'll be more jobs for teleoperations. So people who sit behind a computer with a video game style steering wheel who can log into a robotaxi that's run into an issue it can't handle to guide it out of that issue until the computer can take over again. There's going to be people who need to clean and maintain these vehicles once they roll out at scale. So jobs will, just as is always the case, jobs will be lost, but other jobs will be created. The key thing is that those jobs won't be immediately transferable. So we will need to do some work to make it easier for the people who used to be riding Uber to becoming teleoperations. It won't be, they can't just get out of the one role and immediately into the other. But this has been true of every technological change. There's been friction, and it's the role of the government and industry to find a way to ease those frictions. But it's not just about jobs. There are other reasons to be wary of this technology, especially if it rolls out in sort of a poorly conceived way. And the most obvious way there is that if you make anything simpler and cheaper, which driving automation will do, it'll make taking a road trip simple, it'll be taking a ride-hail ride cheaper. When you make things simpler and cheaper, people consume more of it. So we've got the driverless cars, but the roads aren't changing, not in the near term. And that means more congestion, a lot more congestion. Every road trip is going to take longer because there'll be more vehicles on the road. So commute times, to the extent that people are commuting to work, they get longer. Traffic jams during peak periods. And then all the ways that traffic congestion makes life less pleasant for everyone, like reduced livability in cities, more tire particulate matter in the air, making air quality slightly worse. Congestion is bad, and driving automation is poised to give us much more of it.
That's really interesting, and not at all anything I had considered. But this is actually interesting in relation to your book also, because in your book you argue or like make the case that we should aim for this like robo-taxi future, as opposed to maybe a future where everyone owns their own self-driving car. Could you maybe expand a bit on why you think that's maybe a better model for society?
So this is it's an insight that flows out of the last one. If everyone is driving more in these, or not driving, being chauffeured in self-driving vehicles, but the roads are not getting any bigger, the way that you can retain efficiency is by having fewer single occupant vehicles. I mean, right now you have or actually fewer zero occupancy vehicles. Right now, the one thing you can say is the average number of people in a car is higher than one, because there's got to be one person operating it. Once that's not true anymore, you could have the average occupancy of a vehicle might be something like 0.7, as you've got driverless cars with no one in them moving from point to point. That won't work. And especially it won't work in cities where road space is particularly scarce and at a premium. So what we need to do is we need a world where there's more than one person, there's more than two people, there's more than three people even. The more people we can get in a vehicle on a road, the better. In other words, we need shared fleets. So how do we do that in an urban setting? That is shared rides in robo-taxis. We need to find, if you can get multiple people in a vehicle, you unlock scale economies, you put less pressure on curb space, but it's hard. It's hard. The thing to emphasize is that we could satisfy all of our mobility needs with fewer vehicles if we were able to share them. People don't want to do that. So we need to create the policy conditions that will make shared mobility attractive and accessible in a way that, absent some sort of intervention, it won't be.
Yeah, I think another interesting point that you made in the book that I really hadn't considered before is that like one of the biggest problems that you found when thinking about this future is like curb space and like having space for pickups and drop-offs. Could you maybe expand a bit on why that's like a really critical challenge to solve?
So the interface between the road and the street and the city is the curb. That's where trucks pause to have the drivers get off to deliver packages. It's where taxis pause to let people get in and get out. It's where private owners will just park their car and leave them, depending on what kind of city that you're in. So the curb is something that up to now we really have not managed very well. We had parking meters. Sometimes we have mobile officers going around and ticketing people who are not using the space, but we generally don't monetize that space, or we don't police it very well, and consequently it gets abused. That is a real problem now it's going to be in a robo-taxi world. It's going to be intolerable because there'll be so many people. If we have a world where people are taking much more robo-taxis instead of driving their own cars, they won't be going into garages to park. Everything will be pick up and drop off. And so as night follows day, if you want that world, you have to think very hard about curb management and seeing curb space as valuable real estate that you have to control. You have to use price signals to make sure that it is being used for the best possible uses. So there are firms that are aware of this. There are firms that are monitoring what city curb space is available and trying to provide services for monitoring, monetization, and marketing various kinds of curb space. Those are going to have to go very big. We're already seeing in San Francisco the stress that robo-taxis, as they scale up, pose on urban systems. San Francisco it really is a laboratory for the rest of the world. I think Atlanta, Waymo's coming to New York now. All these other cities should look closely at that and try and get ahead of it, because otherwise it's just going to be a world of pain for everybody.
Yeah, that's really interesting. The thing that I've noticed in San Francisco is that the Waymos are really careful. They're obviously very programmed to be, and so sometimes they'll just get stuck because yeah. But I guess this is the description that, or the thing that you mentioned before, where you could actually have like humans come in and help sort out the situation. Or do you know if that's how they solve it now?
Yeah, there's both Waymo and, although Tesla doesn't talk about it much, well, they don't really like to talk about it much, either firm, but yeah, both firms have what we call teleoperators. So it is still the case that there's no automated driving system that can handle everything. They get confused when they encounter situations that are outside of the training set, or when they encounter situations that a human would intuitively understand. Like when you and I are driving, we understand that it's okay to cross over the yellow line into the oncoming traffic lane if there's no oncoming traffic. And if there's an obstruction and it's easier to go for 15 feet to get around it and then get back in the lane where you're supposed to be, we don't even think about it. We do it. We're careful about it, but we don't question it. It's much harder for machines to do that. It's not they can't, but it is much trickier. It can lead to situations where they just don't know what to do and they pause. How do you handle that? Well, you need to, if you've got a safety driver in the car, it can just take over and drive it through. But often Waymos don't have those. Tesla robotaxis do, at least so far. So the way that you get around it is that someone else in a building across town logs in through their computer, sees what the machine sees through its sensors, and then gives it a trail of digital breadcrumbs to follow. It's like, do this small thing, now do this small thing, do this, gets it out of its jam and into a situation where it can pilot itself again. I suppose in the very distant future, when the technology has really elaborated, we'll need perhaps one for every 100 or one for every 1,000 robotaxis. But in the near to medium term, the numbers are going to be much lower than that. The ratio of cars to teleoperators is going to be low. So there's a growth industry, I suppose, in the near future, teleoperation of vehicles. So yeah, it's a job that kids in school today might be doing in 10 years.
Yeah, that's actually a really interesting, like, I often ask people what because it's hard to know now if you're young what you should study and so on, but maybe this is like a little good idea. Uh, So it would be really interesting to also just hear your like best case possible for a future with the driverless cars, and also a bit like more on how that vision, like if you could describe that vision, and also, for example, do you think that the best case is just 100% driverless cars, or will there still be some cases of humans driving cars where for some reason it's better? Or yeah, could you expand a bit on the best case scenario for this?
The best case scenario, I would say, is a world where Long haul trucking is automated. Trucking is a really hard job. And that's why there's a trucking shortages, because the market just won't bear the prices to make that job something that anyone wants to do. So long haul trucking is automated, and that means that goods movement is cheap, which means wider prosperity, cheaper, wider access of consumer goods. It's a world where robo-taxis in urban and suburban environments are ubiquitous. I mean, I don't want to fantasize, but so a realistic vision would be is that everyone today who owns 2 cars owns one and uses a robo-taxi for all those other trips. Everyone today who owns 1 car owns 0 and uses a robo-taxi for everything, because a robo-taxi is that it's always available, it's always cheap, it's always reliable, and it's safer. In a world like that, everyone gets to take more trips. You know, I'm an old school liberal at heart. I don't want to tell people what the good life is, but no matter what your vision of the good life is, it's easier to achieve it if you can travel more, whether you want to travel to a sporting event, whether you want to travel to work, whether you want to travel to visit your sister and her family for dinner. No matter what you want to do, what your vision of the good life is, cheaper, more reliable, safer travel makes it easier for you to achieve that. And there are more speculative gains, like particularly in cities, if we get more and more driving automation, if more and more people use pickup and drop off space, and need fewer parking spaces to store cars, that's space that we can reclaim. More speculatively, because they drive better, they don't need really wide lanes. So we could narrow lanes and take back space for other things, which in urban environments is highly valuable. Now, infrastructure is hard. That will take decades to make those changes, but it's something that would be on the table in an all automated world. And above all, there'd be more of us. Fewer people would be hurt or killed. So fewer people would have to mourn the death of their loved ones in road incidents, which is something that these days we just take for granted, and we don't have to. I don't think it's the case you'll ever see a world where there are no human drivers. There'll always be enthusiasts who enjoy driving. There'll always be people in the countryside. Self-driving is going to come out to rural areas last, because it's the fewer data in the training set, more edge cases. Yeah, ironically, you will see driverless tractors on the farms faster than you will see driverless trucks going from the farms into town. But though, at least I don't see a world where humans go away. There's no longer any humans behind the wheel. But then it's still the case that people ride horses. Some people do it. We've all heard of it. It isn't impossible to imagine, but almost no one knows someone who uses a horse as a mode of transport, as opposed to a mode of recreation or something like that. I think that's a world where we're going to be ultimately going to get. I don't think I'll live to see that world. It's going to come slower than that, but I welcome its coming. I think it's better for all of us when it arrives.
Yeah, yeah. That was actually the horse example was something that I was thinking of, that because some people really like cars, and so that's great that they can keep doing that. Just like people who love horses can continue to have horses. Just out of curiosity, because you said that people who own 2 cars, maybe they'll just own one, and that car, will that also be driverless, do you think?
So there's 2 ways that we're getting to fully driverless systems. One is the Waymo, or actually it's even more precise to say Zoox. Zoox is the other big robotaxi company. It's an arm of Amazon. Zoox robotaxis have no steering wheel. They've got no human interface to drive the vehicle at all. That's one way to go. It's just, another way to go is what you see Tesla has been doing. Tesla started with its autopilot, which, despite the name, is a driver assist system. It increasingly takes the mundane tasks and just delegates to the human the trickier ones. But every year, the things that it is incapable of handling, that set shrinks a little bit. So you gradually move to a world where there's less and less for a human to do. So yeah, ultimately, private cars will also have, I call it, they'll have a steering wheel, but more and more there'll be a metaphorical button on the dashboard that you can press and the car will drive itself. That is actually, in the book, we talk about this. That's the competition to robo-taxis everywhere world. That's a world where it's exactly like it is now. Everyone owns as many cars as they do now, but that car can drive itself much or all of the time. In that world, we still get increased congestion because the marginal cost in attention of drive is lower, but everything else stays the same. There's no changes in land use. There's no changes in household costs. Everyone just drives more and we have more congestion. That is the world that my co-authors and I deplore. We want to try and get us off of that track. That's why we wrote the book. So how do we get there? Well, the book has got a lot of to say about that, but very briefly, we need better regulation now. We need to be moving forward quickly with the idea that this is a technology that could save lives on the margin. It could save lives on the margin today. There should be a presumption of urgency. Of course, we don't want to sacrifice safety, but the bar to prove safety ahead of time should be less than after the fact. Absolutely, using the insurance subrogation process, penalize companies that have got unsafe products to the full extent that you can, but don't, if they think that their product is safe, make it easy for them to deploy. Secondly, cities in particular should be doing everything they can to get curb management going. It would be good in the near term, just because curbs are abused today. There's value in optimizing their use now. But the earlier we get that started, the easier robotaxis will fit into that framework rather than trying to impose it retroactively. And then finally, this is something that some of the smart regulators are doing, but it should be an avowed best practice, is that everything to do with safety is not considered socially sensitive. Like right now, there are in some places barriers to companies sharing information about safe operation, because if they do that, it could be regarded as weakening their intellectual property in their software. We need to make sure that there's no institutional barriers to that, that all safety best practices get shared as widely as possible, as soon as possible. There are other things, and the book goes into detail for all of them. For headline goals, it is better regulation, faster and sooner, not just of vehicles, but of curbs.
Yeah, I think that about summarizes it. Thank you so much. I think that I really recommend people, if they want to explore this more, to see your book, The End of Driving. It was a really interesting read, and I think it's just really interesting to think of something like that's so concrete, a technology like this, but it's so obvious that we have the technology, but there's so much more to think about before we have it in society. And yeah, the driverless car is definitely something that we should keep our eye on, and like you said, treat with urgency almost, because regardless, it's going to take just a lot of time, it seems. Do you have anything else that you want to add
And
just before we?
Yeah, well, I would say that if you are interested in these issues, but the prospect of diving into a full book is a bit daunting, I write a twice weekly newsletter on Substack called Changing Lanes. And I delve into all of the ideas in the book in sort of smaller essay length chunks there. So if you want to know more before committing to the book, the newsletter is a great entry point for that, as well as other things to do with innovative mobility. What is there's a lot of things we haven't talked about. What does public transit look like in a driving automation world? What does land use look like in the suburbs in a driving automation world? I get into all those things there. And I'd be delighted if your listener wanted to look at the work that I've published at Changing Lanes.
That sounds perfect. I'll make sure to also link that as well as the book when we publish the episode, so people can find it easily.
That's very kind of you.
But yeah, Andrew, thank you so much for taking the time.
And my pleasure.